From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump promises immediate tariffs on Mexico and Canada upon taking office next year. But is this bluster for negotiation or signs of a broader Trump approach toward tariffs and trade in a second term? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. About 6:30 on Monday evening, Donald Trump sent out the tweet heard around the world, or at least heard in America's trading partners in the USMCA agreement. Here's what he said. Thousands of people are pouring through Mexico and Canada, bringing crime and drugs at levels never seen before. Right now, a caravan coming from Mexico composed of thousands of people seems to be unstoppable in its quest to come through our currently open border. On January 20th, as one of my many first executive orders, I will sign all necessary documents to charge Mexico and Canada a 25% tariff on all products coming into the United States. This tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion. And Alicia, the big question, the $1.8 trillion question, if I can put it that way, because that is the amount of trade, two-way trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Is Trump serious at this, or is this an effort to lay the groundwork for some kind of negotiation in his first days in office?
Well, I'm not sure those are actually mutually exclusive. I think he is serious in his desire to impose tariffs as a household remedy, though I also think this is a negotiating tactic in this instance to try to get Mexico to agree to some kind of further limits on migration, to do more to control its southern border so you don't have as many Central Americans and South Americans, particularly Venezuelans, coming up, and maybe help with trying to repatriate migrants in the U.S. or who come to the border back to their home countries. Going back to, well, is he serious? Well, if you look at his first term, he did follow through on some of his threats, not all of them. He did impose the 10 to 20% tariffs on steel and aluminum, though he eventually was forced to provide some kinds of exemptions to Mexico and Canada after they retaliated. He did impose a wide array of tariffs on China under the Section 301 in supposedly retaliation for its mercantile trade practices. Those really actually didn't achieve its objectives, one of which was to stop the forced transfer of IP and other IP theft. Most of those tariffs are still in effect, and China continues to steal intellectual property from U.S. companies, both doing business in China and those actually in the U.S. Yes, I think he's serious, but I also wouldn't count on him imposing these tariffs at the end of the day.
Some of the response now coming in, the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, is saying this: President Trump, it isn't with threats or tariffs that we resolve the migratory phenomenon or the abuse of drugs in the United States. What's needed to confront these great challenges is cooperation and understanding. She also suggested that retaliatory tariffs might be coming from Mexico, which would harm U.S. companies, automakers in particular, that have integrated supply chains over the borders and that use those supply chains to help compete with rivals overseas, foreign car makers. Let's listen also to a bit of response this morning by Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario.
We received the biggest threat we've ever received from our closest friends and ally, from President-elect Trump, that they're threatening to put a 25% tariff on all goods coming across the border into the U.S. and Mexico. What I found unfair about the comments is to compare us to Mexico. And I can tell you, Canada is no Mexico. We do approximately, just Ontario alone, $500 billion of two-way trade. I found his comments unfair. I found them insulting. It's like a family member stabbing you right in the heart. I spent a lot of time in the U.S., and I have yet to talk to one American that has any issue with Canadians.
Monet, there was an interesting argument here of why have Canada in this list if what Trump is really concerned about is migrant caravans that are marching through Mexico. And I think you can broaden that argument to some of the trade actions that he took in his first term as well, because the argument that you sometimes hear from Trump supporters of these kinds of tariffs and trade actions is that we are cracking down on abuses, intellectual property theft in China, and so forth. But we saw a similar sort of phenomenon in Trump's first term, that he was putting tariffs on allies like South Korea and like Canada. And it's hard for me to fit that into a framework where this is focusing on adversaries and trade abuses.
Yeah, I think you have to put Trump's inclusion of Canada in his statement about his day one tariffs into the context of the USMCA agreement, which the United States is slated to be reviewing in 2026, along with Mexico and Canada, who are the other parties to it. So, of course, this was the signature achievement of Trump's trade agenda in his first term, renegotiating NAFTA, which he had campaigned against, saying that U.S. economy gave away far too much in that free trade agreement struck in the 1990s. But he does think that despite being a large-scale success, that there were some provisions that were not quite as tight as he would have liked them to be in retrospect, particularly when it comes to importing autos from Mexico. And so he knows that these two countries are both going to be coming to the table again in 2026, and he wants to have as much leverage as possible to make sure that he's able to revise it in the ways that he would like to do. And so I think that's why Canada ended up getting looped in here. Frankly, I think that the Premier of Ontario was being a little bit unfair to Mexico in his characterization, saying that Canada is a long-term and major trading partner of the United States, whereas Mexico, he implies, mostly sends us illegal immigrants and drugs. Mexico has grown into being an extremely significant trading partner of the United States as well. And that's not just for goods like importing, food and agricultural products or cheap manufactured goods. They're increasingly sending a lot of higher end goods, particularly autos. They have grown a lot of their production in that field, but a lot of other manufactured goods too, and is a very significant trading partner of the United States. And so I think that it is a reflection of the fact that Trump sees the purpose of these tariffs as an all-purpose tool to guide trade policy in the direction that he wants, strengthening domestic manufacturing and reducing the U.S. trade imbalance, and is not merely using it as a way to get Mexico to comply on immigration policy, drug enforcement, and other issues like that.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. If it really is about negotiation, then you could maybe foresee some kind of deal, Alicia, maybe even before he takes office on January 20th, that Mexico agrees to crack down on migrant caravans. Maybe this says they're open to reinstating the Remain in Mexico agreement, which had migrants, if they were claiming asylum in the U.S., sent them back to Mexico to wait for their court hearings there. I mean, that's a plausible policy outcome that Trump would want and maybe be able to get through this kind of deal. But Alicia, what do you make of the notion that looping in Canada here suggests a broader intent to upend the USMCA trade deal, which I think Trump thinks of as an accomplishment of his? And my view is that it was mostly a restating of the NAFTA trade deal with some tweaking around the edges. But if he's talking about actually imposing tariffs on his first day that would breach that agreement, then that suggests that he maybe wants to go into another round of negotiations and replace USMCA, I don't know, with MCUSA.
Right. So a couple of points here on the Remain in Mexico. I think the Biden executive order has actually largely achieved the same objectives in terms of actually reducing border crossings and pushing them toward actually the ports of entry. I don't know. It's not clear what else he wants Mexico to do. I mean, he could reinstate Remain in Mexico, but that doesn't appear like it would do all that much more than the Biden executive order does right now. And that it actually only about 70,000 migrants were actually detained or held in Mexico under Remain in Mexico. So to your second point, that this looks like to be a gambit to try to renegotiate the USMCA, that looks maybe more plausible than, just to get Mexico to remain in Mexico. Now, on that, United Auto Workers have complained that the big three companies, those would be Stellantis, Ford, and GM, are shifting more production to Mexico. And to some extent, actually, Canada. GM actually has a relatively large footprint in Canada, which may be why it sold off in markets on Tuesday, was because it actually has a sizable footprint in Canada and as well as Mexico. And so there's probably going to be some effort to try to further clamp down on the provisions in the USMCA that said a certain share of contents must be made in North America, so maybe increasing that share. There's also a provision in the USMCA that requires for autos a certain amount must be made with labor that is paid at least $16 an hour. And that was really intended to restrict how much automakers could outsource, so to speak, to Mexico. So there may be an effort to try to raise that wages further to try to force more production in the US and actually Canada, because wages are relatively comparable in Canada. The other beef or perennial beef, and no pun intended, is a lot of the dairy farmers don't like USMCA, and they also weren't terribly happy with NAFTA. They want further restrictions on Canadian exports of dairy products to the US. But those are really the main things, and I think that that's why the US automaker stock sold off. Wasn't just because of this threat of the 25% tariffs. It's because they viewed it as an opening salvo to renegotiate the pact in a way that could make these automakers less competitive. Really, NAFTA did make the U.S. automakers much more competitive and U.S. manufacturing more competitive vis-a-vis Asian, like Japanese and South Korea. And it really helped the U.S. attract more auto investment in addition to Mexico and Canada.
Part of what gives me pause about what Trump's real intent is that during the 2024 campaign, he spoke pretty broadly about his use of tariffs, his belief in tariffs. And Trump has always been a fan of tariffs as a remedy. But in recent months, Monet, he's been talking about them maybe replacing the income tax. You could raise enough money via tariffs to get rid of any personal income taxes on Americans. He's talked about them as a tariff wall to protect manufacturing jobs from foreign competitors. He has talked about how he is a fan of President McKinley and the tariffs that used to fund the U.S. government before the U.S. government grew and enacted all sorts of programs like Social Security and Medicare, which cannot, in my view, can be funded by tariffs. There simply aren't enough imports coming into the U.S. And then he talked about a 10% universal tariff. That's one of the things that President Trump campaigned on. Let's listen to him in October at the Economic Club of Chicago, tangling on this subject with the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News.
Critics say your tariffs will end up being like a national sales tax. Because if you have America at the moment has $3 trillion worth of imports, you're going to add tariffs to every single one of them. That is going to push up the cost for all those people who want to buy foreign goods. That is just simple mathematics, President Trump.
It's not. Yeah, it is, but not the way you figured. I was always very good at mathematics. Yes. Let me tell you, you're saying $3 trillion.
That's $3 trillion worth of imports.
And they don't have to pay. And the higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the country.
The higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to have to pay in shops.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away.
So, Monet, it seems like there are two stories that Trump tells about tariffs. One is that they're great for negotiating, but if that's the purpose, then the goal is to get something in return and to not actually impose the tariff, in which case they don't serve this other story that Trump tells, which is that they're going to be great for revenue and great for bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S.
Absolutely. And the way you just put it, I want to emphasize that it's actually three stories. There's the revenue pitch, the idea that tariffs are going to raise so much money for the government, we'll be able to replace the income tax or pay for other priorities. There's the reshoring pitch, essentially the idea that it's going to be good for domestic industry, both foreign companies coming into the U.S. market to build, but also giving a competitive advantage to American companies. And then there's the negotiating pitch, which is saying that the threat threat of tariffs is going to be something to steer foreign powers to be able to balance their own trade practices in a way that's going to benefit the U.S. economy. And Trump makes different pitches depending on who the audience is and how he's feeling at the time. And it becomes very difficult to tell what his actual inclination is. But frankly, I think that the way that he described in that interview with Bloomberg News, the advantage to the American economy that would come from the tariffs is completely disingenuous in the sense that, yes, obviously, if you raise a tariff barrier, that's going to encourage foreign companies to build domestically, but they will produce at a higher cost because they'll be shielded from foreign competition, which means that they're still going to be increasing the price of the goods that they're selling to American consumers or the inputs that they're selling to other manufacturers. There is a reason why there's a consensus among just about all contemporary economists, especially free market ones, that tariffs are bad for the economy no matter how you implement them, no matter what goods you implement them on. And that's why some of the people in Trump's inner circle are always trying to speak for him in saying that what he really means is the negotiating leverage side of the argument. And so I think it will be up to Scott Bessent, Trump's new pick for Treasury Secretary, the other economic advisors around him, to try to always steer him in the direction of saying, we understand that you're acting strategically here by proposing these tariffs. We're going to see what concessions we can try to extract from our adversaries and make sure that he doesn't move in the direction of, for example, trying to get the tariffs incorporated into a coming tax bill in the new year, which is something that would make it very difficult to reverse course once he implements them. And so the form that he ends up proposing the tariffs in becomes extremely important in terms of leaving himself wiggle room to actually remove them so that they can be effective negotiating tools rather than a permanent revenue tool and a drag on the economy.